Well, we might as well get started. I'd like to welcome you to the first Sheridan College Museum of Discovery Science lecture of the season. I'm Amy Erickson. I'm plant science and biology instructor here, and I am really excited to introduce Dr. Margo Hennet as our first speaker tonight. She's got a very diverse experience with animals, including wildlife, not just dogs. She told me that she spent some time in Namibia, which I hear is really hard to get into. So that's exciting. Doing conservation work on cheetahs, and has worked in Texas doing rehabilitation with wildlife, and then decided to focus on veterinary medicine and went to CSU where she got her vet degree and also specialized in internal medicine. Does a variety of research in microbiology and genetics, and also helps with research and development with various products like pet foods and toys and fun things like that. So lots of different experiences, and we're really excited to hear about this debate.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome.
Hi, guys. Like Amy said, my name is Margo. I'm really excited to be here, and I didn't realize this would be the first one of the semester. So hopefully we open it with a bang. Today's topic is going to be the real differences between dogs and wolves. I'm going to do a quick intro on myself first. So I figured, let's see the clicker. Aha, okay. So since it's fall, and since I don't like putting pictures of myself up on PowerPoints, I put one of my favorite comics that I keep on the fridge since it's fall now. This just tickles me every time. So happy fall. I live in Story. And right now I do a combination of mobile vet work with just dogs and cats, and quite a bit of consulting for various fields in veterinary medicine. As Amy mentioned, I've been a little bit all over, both in terms of professional interest and across the country. But the reason I wanted to bring this topic to you guys was because I think that it's pertinent to all of our lives, in the sense that, well, we'll just dive in actually, in the sense that 65 million homes in the United States have at least one dog, okay? And now more than ever, dogs are part of the family, okay? 85% of those dog owning households consider dogs to be family. And in fact, 51% of those dog owning households consider dogs to be on the same footing as their human children or other human relatives. And I totally don't blame them. I have 2 toddlers and 2 dogs, and we encounter a lot of pressure now in terms of taking care of our dogs, okay? Because we are seeing a lot of chatter online, speculation, marketing to say that, I'm sure all of you have heard this, right? That since dogs are descendants of wolves, that the wolf represents the ideal state of being for our dogs, and that therefore we should strive in all ways possible to achieve the wolf for our dog, right? I know that I've heard it in food marketing, I've heard it in pet toy marketing, in training and behavior management of your dogs. And I mean, who can blame them, right? I mean, look at those two. They're obviously the same thing. In fact, they do share a lot of similarities. 99.9% of their DNA is the same. Okay, but we have Canis lupus and we have Canis familiaris, or some people say Canis lupus familiaris. So at least subspecies differences. And that 0.1% difference in the DNA represents some really unique and interesting differences between dogs and wolves that have predominantly occurred due to the 30,000-year journey that they have taken right alongside us. Okay, and so for that reason, I think that 0.1% difference actually represents really relevant changes in terms of dogs' lives with us and understanding wolf ecology, and for an interest perspective, understanding why they're different, okay? So the path to modern dogs, really quickly. modern day wolves are not the direct ancestor of our domesticated dogs. Okay, domestic dogs right here and our present day wolves, they share a common ancestor with an ancient line of wolf that is now extinct. Okay, and that comes to be relevant when we start talking about some of these differences and similarities. So I want to make that one really clear. That common ancestor, that split started about when domestication started, about 30,000 years ago-ish. And that's all based on archaeological record and a little bit of fancy schmancy genetic analysis that we can do now and backdate some of the changes that have occurred. However, interestingly, that's really hard to do with dogs because since they're pets, they've moved around geographically so much that it's really hard to pinpoint where and when some changes happened in the past 30,000 years for dogs. I also want to just point out real quick that this split from the common ancestor when domestication started also represented a shift in these selection pressures that our dogs experienced versus what became modern day wolves experienced, of course, right? Because you're living alongside humans versus you're living out in the wild and being left alone. That trickled down to create what we call, in this chart, they're calling them present FRD free-ranging dogs. So they're domesticated dogs, but they might not necessarily belong to humans and live in a house and sleep on a bed. Then you had the last 200 to 500 years, we had this very intense selection happening here where we were actually creating breeds. We were creating the purebred lineages that we see all over the place today. Okay, so we had the split from the common ancestor and then the transition over into making specific breeds. And in between, there was one more selection step. But I'm going to talk about that later because I don't want to ruin my surprise. Okay, so the first, this is a friend of mine, and this is his golden puppy. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the very first step in domestication was selecting against fear or for tameness. That was really the first pressure that was experienced by this original dog, if you will. I'm going to talk about this gene, but then I want to talk about some physical changes too. So selecting against fear, what does that mean? There are a number of genes that actually control our response to new stimuli and challenges and dictate whether we respond to those with fear or interest or, I don't know, skepticism. And in a meta-analysis that was done a few years ago, where they analyzed an enormous amount of genetic data, they identified a number of genes that were either upregulated or downregulated in domestic dogs compared to wolves, and also in tame foxes compared to wild foxes. So they actually used two different models to demonstrate the same thing. And one very nice representative gene in that finding, I'm only going to talk about one, but you'll get the idea, is this STMND1. And domestic dogs compared to wolves had downregulation of STMD1. So they were relatively deficient in that gene, okay? And what that meant was, well, actually what scientists did to find out what that meant was they then went to laboratory mice and induced a deficiency in that gene to see what would happen. And those mice lost their innate and learned fear responses when they were deficient in that gene. So it's a very nice example of a genetic change that has occurred between our domestic dogs and our wolf populations. With that domestication event, it's an ongoing it was an ongoing process, probably still is, but 30,000 years ago, domestication started. And what first changed that we saw in the archaeologic record? Very interesting. These dogs suddenly started having these canids that we were seeing with human population remnants, had shorter snouts, they had broader brain cases, and they had more crowded teeth. That was not what was being selected for, but it came hand in hand with this behavioral selection. And that's a really interesting phenomenon that we're going to explore here, how by selecting for one thing, there was inadvertent selection for a number of other changes. Okay. And this is Bodie cornbread, by the way. He's a golden, he's not afraid. Now we have a number of other, as I mentioned, inadvertent or intentional genetic changes that occurred. So I want to talk about a few of them that I found really interesting. This is by no means going to be comprehensive, but it will be interesting. So one of them is body size. This gene is called IGF-1. I think this is so cool. I told you there was another step. It happened about 7,000 years ago right here, where we started in the archaeologic records seeing small dogs and big dogs. And initially that was very surprising. Okay, but what we saw was that there was actually starting to be some selection pressure happening by whatever those humans were doing, where they were starting to generate populations of large dogs and little dogs in this domesticated dog population. Now this gene IGF-1 though, it didn't pop up here. It's at least 50,000 years old. The mutation in that gene that makes little dogs versus big dogs is at least 50,000 years old. Okay, that's pre-domestication, if you remember. So as many genes do, once you get a mutation, you have variants. And there's a small variant in IGF-1 and a large variant in IGF-1. And every dog has 2 copies of this gene, one from mom, one from dad, and they'll either inherit the small or the large variant from each of their parents. Wolves have, modern day wolves, they have 2 copies of the large variants. Over here, coyotes and jackals, they have 2 copies of the small variants. And they split way up here before wolves and dogs split as well. Dogs, depending on their size, will have one or both. 75% of dogs who are under 30 pounds have 2 copies of that small variant. Okay. There's a 52,500 year old remains of an ancient wolf that scientists found that has one of each. Okay. And that wolf was in this lineage right here, or well, up here, but is thought to be one of the direct ancestors of these canids, and maybe the originator of that mutation. Who knows? But we know it's at least that old. So I think that's really interesting. And that's how we eventually get to our friends being so small or so little. Okay. Another fun genetic observation is about neural crest cells. I promise I'm not going to get too nitty gritty on this. There's a theory or a hypothesis that selecting for tameness led to this hand-in-hand selection for a change in embryonic neural crest cell migration and presence. And the reason that this hypothesis came about was because, well, for 2 reasons. One, we see in our dogs that they have a lot of different physical features from wolves, obviously, right? They have floppy ears, they have curly tails, they have different coat colors. And there's a famous experiment that's still ongoing. It's at least 60 years old, where they are doing this with foxes. Has anyone heard of this in Russia?
Yes.
Right? So they took pretty much wild foxes, and then they basically domesticated them, right? And then they were observing for physical, they were just selecting for tameness, but they wanted to see what other physical changes would happen. And those foxes, their ears got floppy. They got different patches of colors on their coats. Their tails started curling. Okay. So this theory says that, okay, in a wild fox or wolf, you have these neural crest cells who in the developing embryo do some migration. They help dictate what and where the little body architecture and blueprint's supposed to do. And they do it very early on. And the theory is that actually, for whatever reason, this hand in hand, or this selection for tameness just came hand in hand with a selection for reduced neural crest cells in the developing embryo. And that this is the reason that you have all of these changes happening physically alongside this behavioral selection. It's been debated, but there was a recent study that looked at it in a pretty thorough way, and there's pretty good support that the genes that underlie the neural crest cell presence are actually downregulated and upregulated in response to this domestication process. All right, this one is also a really cool genetic one. It's about coat color. We can call it the K-locus gene. And these pictures, I should have actually prefaced this, but these pictures and this picture right here are all taken by Dan and Cindy Hartman of Silvergate, Montana. They have an amazing gallery, and they go out to Yellowstone in the winter and the summer, and they follow these wolf packs and take amazing pictures of them. I clearly have one of their pictures here, and they were nice enough to allow me to use their pictures in this presentation. So unless otherwise credited, the wolf pictures are from them. So it's a little bit of an art show also. So these Yellowstone wolves, I just think this is so amazing. You can see obviously that some wolves are black and some wolves are gray. And in Yellowstone, it's about a 50-50 split, which is which. This coat color is controlled by the K-locus gene. There's a mutation on that gene that leads to the black coat color. Fascinatingly, that mutation was introduced by a dog a few thousand years ago, interbreeding with these wolves in the northwestern part of North America. Even cooler, this gene appears to be linked to immune function in some way. So what they're finding is that these black wolves who have this mutated K-locus gene have an immunity boost, and they do better during disease outbreaks in Yellowstone National Park than the gray wolves do. There's a flip side. The gray wolves seem to be more aggressive or assertive during conflicts, and they also have a higher rate of reproductive success. Even cooler than that is that most mate pairings in Yellowstone involve two individuals of opposite colors, which maybe, hopefully, confers the pro benefits to the offspring, right? So this whole story is just fascinating. And if you guys ever go to Yellowstone, you see a black wolf, you'll have some really cool background to talk about. Okay, nutrition. Yay. This is a hot topic with people, I know. And I'm picking on blue buffalo, but I don't mean to. It's just a very representative bag. Okay, you guys have all heard chatter, and I'm sure been subject to very aggressive marketing to suggest to you that what wolves eat is what dogs should eat. And if you don't feed your dog what wolves eat, then you are a bad dog owner. And often these bags are marketed, right, with this piercing blue-eyed wolf on a kibble bag, nature's evolutionary diet. And I guarantee you, this one says no corn, no wheat or soy, but I guarantee you there's some stuff in this bag that wolves never see in their lives. And so we're subject to this really intense pressure, right, to make these decisions based on marketing pressure. But in fact, I want to talk about one way that dogs and wolves are very significantly and very importantly different, and it is genetic and it is digestive, okay? Wolves do not really encounter cereals or starches much in their lives in the wild. And they're not very good at digesting starches. They're not. They don't do it efficiently, causes issues. It's not a great dietary staple for them anyway. But dogs, having spent 30,000 years living with people, have also, from that relationship, shifted from being pack hunters to being scavengers predominantly. And in so doing, what are you scavenging if you're living right next to people? French fries, right? Ancient French fries. You're scavenging whatever the food trash is that people were eating, okay? And that's a lot of exposure to grains and starches and cereals. And guess what? That gene, AMY2B, encodes the expression of amylase, which is a digestive enzyme produced in the pancreas. Its job is to digest starches. Dogs have a dramatic, huge increase in the copy number of these genes. and they make more amylase. And they efficiently digest starches. They can do it. Grains are okay. So although there is breed and individual differences though, since that change, we do see variation. If you compare like a border collie to, I don't know, a Chihuahua or something, you're going to see different copy number magnitudes. And so some dogs and some individuals will be more or less efficient about digesting those starches. And certainly some individuals will have sensitivities or allergies. But I'm going to stick with speaking on a population level here, that dogs are genetically adapted to eating starches and grains. Very interestingly, there's some unpublished data out of CU Boulder that shows that a similar change is happening today in coyotes that live in urban and suburban environments. And they're encountering a lot and relying on a lot of like human discarded food. And there's a selection pressure there that is leading for them to also increase their copy number of this gene so that they can digest those starches. Okay. Before I jump off of nutrition, just in the spirit of discussing all these pressures, I'm sure everyone's heard about raw versus fresh versus kibble diets. I'm not going to get into that. That's like a 3-hour conversation. But I do want to touch on the raw diet concept because I think partially it comes from this idea that wolves eat their meat raw, right? So in this alternative reality where your pug is living in the wild, it's going to be eating raw food. So that's what it should be eating at home. And I think that it kind of romanticizes the wolf existence a little bit too much. I think wolves definitely deserve our admiration. They are so inspiring and amazing to see in the wild, but it's not all rainbows and unicorns. So I'm going to transition and use this segue to talk about why and how the wolf reality is frankly different from our dog reality, and why we might not necessarily always want to strive for the wolf life for our dogs. So the first one is that raw food, especially wild raw food, comes with parasites and diseases. It does, okay? Wolves have parasite loads in their gut, on their skin. They carry them all the time. It is an energy drain. And if it is severe, it can actually tip the scales in favor of starvation and death for these animals. Bones break teeth, so do antlers, even wolf teeth. All the time, actually. And so don't think that wolves have some kind of like magical chewing hardware that can chew through anything. That's just not true. And we actually see that in years or seasons when the food sources are low, wolves will eat a lot more of the carcass. They're going to use as much of that carcass as they can because there isn't this plethora of food lying for them. So they'll chew a lot on the bones. And in those conditions, the rate of tooth fracture in wolves doubles. Okay, so we know that it happens and we know why it happens. Bones, antlers. Those broken teeth can lead to infections so bad that they literally cannot catch, chew, or even kill anything, and they will starve. Not always, but if it's bad enough, it will. If the pulp is exposed, it usually happens. Wolves don't get vaccines or parasites or parasite prevention, parasiticides. So taking Yellowstone just as an example, they've had outbreaks of parvovirus, distemper virus, and particularly sarcoptic mange was a big one a few years ago for them, which is a little mite that lives on your skin and makes you super, super, super itchy and makes you lose all your hair. So they're dealing with that, right? We vaccinate our dogs, we deworm them, we use parasiticides. Their bodies don't have to deal with that here. And I'm not arguing like one or the other. I'm just emphasizing that this is a difference in the lives that they live. Also, fights with other wolves are a big thing. When they happen, they can be very intense. And fighting with other wolves is yet another leading cause of death for wolves in the wild because they will kill each other when they fight sometimes. Whereas dog fights, although I'll get to this later, but they tend to be more frequent, but they also tend to be a little less intense, usually. And then human-mediated violence is another cause of death for wolves in the wild, right? Whether that's poaching or livestock conflicts or hit by cars or things like that. So these are the leading causes of death for wolves, and our domestic dogs who live in the house and sleep on the bed, they have a different list of leading cause of death. It's, it's cancer, it's chronic disease, it's natural causes, it's heart failure. In between are those free roaming domesticated dogs, right? Where they are actually kind of experiencing more of the leading causes of death of these wolves. So it's not so much a genetic basis as just a ecology context consideration, but I just want to make sure that we talk about it. Okay, before I go, I just wanted to take two examples, and the resolution, I couldn't get it better than this, but these stories I think are so interesting, and they just are a really nice example of looking at the lives that wild wolves lead. But Wolf 21M was, I think, a wolf in the 90s, late 80s. And I mean, here's the story. I'll read it for you. So he, just prior to his birth, his father was illegally shot and killed. His mother and the pups were relocated back into Yellowstone. He became an alpha male of a pack, partnered with a female who was killed due to a wolf-wolf conflict, and then partnered with another female and eventually died of natural causes. When we look at his skull, I don't know if you guys can appreciate this right here. This is his canine tooth, and this is a zoom in of his canine tooth. This is a big old slab fracture on his canine tooth. That had to hurt like heck. Okay. He also had evidence of periodontal disease and bone loss, which is an affliction that many of our domestic dogs suffer from as well. So don't think that wolves don't get this, is the moral of this story. And then there's a female here who, she died about 8 years old. That's actually not that crazy for a wolf. Okay, that's another thing, is their lifespans do tend to be a little bit shorter. What I think is really interesting here is she had tooth wear, she had cracked teeth, all of the things you saw earlier, but she also had this. This is from a bite wound. And she had, see this kind of darker, like speckling look around her bone here? That's bone porosity. It represents bone loss. That happens when you have a bone infection. Okay, so she had this when she died, and who knows how long she was living with it. And that's just the reality of living out where you don't have like a vet looking after you or a human taking you to the vet, right? Okay, but back to dogs and wolves, comparing reproduction.
Actually, this is my puppy.
Oh, she's 11 weeks old now. But one really interesting thing that's, I think, fascinating between dogs and wolves is that there's actually a huge difference in how they parent. Okay, so domestic dogs, even if you didn't intervene and take the puppies away and give them to new owners at 8 weeks old or whatever, the moms will cease to care for them when they're just a few months old. That's probably a result, again, of walking hand in hand with humans for so long, where humans were actually providing that parental nurture, and the dogs were like, sweet, I'm out, right? Wolves actually will provide maternal care to their cubs for 1 to 3 years. Okay, so that's a huge difference, actually. Okay, so now we're getting into anatomy, and this is Bodie Cornbread again in his puppyhood. And this, I also think, I think all of this is cool, so I'm going to stop saying that word, but puppy dog eyes. There is a muscle that dogs have that wolves do not. It's the levator anguli oculi medialis. It's this one right here. And it's responsible for doing that really adorable, like, puppy dog eye, I'm so sad, please feed me before I die face. Wolves literally don't have that. They literally cannot make that face. And that is a result of a selection pressure that was unintentional, but basically living with humans, turns out if you can make that face, you get more food. Okay. And what's really interesting is that dogs know it. They've done behavioral studies on dogs where they've tested them like food with a human present, food without a human present, no human present, when dinner time is about to happen. And all of these, give the food and then leave the room. And in all of these cases, these dogs were exercising that muscle significantly more frequently and with longer duration when the humans were present in any context, but especially when it was human and food. But if you put the food bowl down and you walk away, they're chilling. They're not working those eyebrows. So they know what they're doing, and it's very effective. Okay. So I thought you guys, instead of seeing an eyeball drawing, I wanted to show you a picture of the retina. So the eyeball, the back of the eye, the back layer, the inside-most layer of the back of the eye is called the retina, and its light comes through our pupils and it goes straight through and it hits the retina. And then all the light signals go through this optic disc and into the optic nerve, which goes to your brain. And that's how vision is made. The ganglion cells in the retina are part of the components of the retina that help to detect light, but also movement and process everything to make images and information for the brain. Wolves have their ganglion cells oriented in a horizontal streak across the retina, and dogs, it's all clustered on like a central disc. Okay. The horizontal streak is better for detecting movement, especially along the periphery, but in general detecting movement. Whereas dogs, it's better for high acuity vision, which actually matches better with what human vision is. So once again, very interesting difference that is undoubtedly a result of our parallel journey through time. Okay, so then we get into dentition. This is Lainey. She's a little chihuahua that belonged to one of my vet techs when I was a vet down in Broomfield, Colorado. She's a little land shark. She's not very nice. But her mouth is like, it can't even like open big enough to get my thumb in it. So there's nothing she can do, right? And I put her on here because she's a really good example of a very extreme example of the physical changes that we see in our domestic dogs. I mentioned crowded teeth being one of the very first things that we saw in the archaeologic record with domestication. Well, that's been amplified by like times 1,000 as we go for these purebred dogs. And in fact, as we shrink our dogs down, sure, the teeth do shrink, but they don't shrink in direct proportion. So tiny dog teeth are relatively larger compared to the tiny dog body size than the ratio that you would ascribe to like a German Shepherd. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. The result of this is that you have teeth that are too big in a mouth that is way too small. And you get a lot of crowding. You get teeth that actually have to rotate in order to erupt. Mm-hmm. And it means that the way the teeth fit together and bite is all wonky and weird. It causes wear on the teeth. It causes damage into the mouth. It very much predisposes them to severe periodontal disease as well. And it also means that, especially in this lower jaw, where there's really just not a lot of real estate bone-wise, these teeth that are too big for the jaw that they're in are occupying their roots way too much of that jawbone, and it weakens the jaw. Especially when they start to get disease, which eats away the bone around the tooth. You will have dogs. I've done tons and tons of dentals where especially these canine teeth and these big molars in the back, there's maybe a millimeter of bone on the bottom of that tooth root between that and air. That's what they're chewing on. Okay. If the tooth is intact, it provides support, but as soon as you get disease in there and the tooth gets wiggly or diseased, that support goes away, and you might as well just be chewing on a tiny, tiny, tiny toothpick. Okay, so these dogs, like this dog, is not a dog you want to give a bone to or an antler, because she will break her jaw or she will break her teeth. This is a Labrador jaw, just for comparison. You can see how the teeth are just better spaced out. Okay, they have slightly more normal proportion to their snout and their teeth in general. I think that's all I want to say about teeth. Respiration. Okay, so I wanted to mention we have a lot of breeds out there that are brachycephalic, meaning they have squished faces. And although they are quite cute, they are also quite dysfunctional. And I mean that very affectionately because most of them are incredibly friendly. But basically what this means is that if you think about a normal, let's think of a Labrador in our heads, dog muzzle, that nasal cavity, it's not just empty space. There are a ton of nasal turbinates, which are like these fine, fine scrolls of bone. And just a quick thing, I have skulls in here, model skulls and real ones of dogs. So if you guys want to look later and look inside the nasal cavity, see what I'm talking about, definitely do that. I also have a Chihuahua one in here and you can see how. But basically what happens when we create these brachycephalic dogs is you smush their snouts like an accordion, developmentally speaking. They don't just shrink, they smush, they do this in the smushing. So it means that the airflow through the nose is not a straight line. It is not easy, okay? In addition to that, they tend to have very narrow nostrils. They tend to have very narrow tracheas or windpipes relative to their body size as well. They're soft palates, which if everyone puts the tongue on the top of their mouth and you feel the hard part with the ridges, that's your hard palate. We'll move it all the way back. You can kind of feel where it drops off and just becomes squishy. That's your soft palate. Don't gag yourselves. I almost did. And the soft palate in these dogs also didn't get the memo about the shrinkage. So it stays a little bit too long and it's actually in here dangling across the opening of the windpipe. Okay, so it's getting in the way. All of that basically is like breathing for them is like trying to drink a smoothie through a coffee stirrer straw. That's basically what it's like. So you need to create this huge vacuum to get that air in, and that can actually make things worse because there are these little laryngeal saccules in the back that are typically like little pockets in the back of your throat. But if you create enough vacuum, they invert and they become like little balloons. And then they get in the way too, and it just makes it worse. Fortunately, there are interventions. So dogs that are very, just as an aside, so that nobody's like absolutely horrified if they have a Frenchie or something. But there are interventions if you have a dog that's very affected by this. There's surgical things that you can do. You can reduce the soft palate. You can open the nostrils, that kind of thing to just help them out a little bit. I mentioned this though, because like these dogs are not running miles and miles and miles to chase an elk, right? Like that's just not going to happen. So again, there are some differences here that we have created. And they're all genetic based, but we've definitely selected for them in this sense. This is a breed intensive selection result, right? I also wanted to, I put this as a reminder, Kindenschema is a word. It's a word. It's a German word, and it refers to this effect where a human sees something with infant-like features and your brain chemistry reacts by wanting to nurture it and love it and take care of it. Those infant features are big eyes, large foreheads, big old heads, short little noses. I mean, right? And so there's actually studies that have looked at like, why do people think these dogs are so darn cute? And it turns out that that's why. Because we've basically taken what most puppies have when they're born, but maintained it all the way through into adulthood, because all puppies have short little noses and big heads, and just like babies, right? Their little arms are like this long. And so we've basically done that, but maintained it in adult dogs like Boston Terriers, French Bulldogs, Pugs, etc. Okay. So I think that's also a really interesting one. Okay, orthopedics. We also have some differences in orthopedics that are predominantly breed related. Here's a corgi. You all know that corgis are considered to be quite adorable, partially because of their little T-Rex legs. And so we also have that for beagles, basset hounds, dachshunds, right? It is cute, but it does cause some issues because again, nothing is without its cost. So these breeds are called chondrodystrophic breeds, and that basically means malformed skeleton breeds. Okay, and that's because what happens in development to get this, it's a genetic change as well, but basically their bones, they're shorter, but they also warp to achieve that shortness. So these aren't perfect x-rays, but on the right is like a normal dog forelimb, and on the left is a corgi, and you can see the warpage, right? The reason that this matters, like who cares, is because that warpage changes the joint angles of every joint in that limb, which means that the stresses that that joint has to deal with in life are not the ones that it's prepared to deal with in life. And as a result, you have these dogs just very classically get pretty profound arthritis as they get older. They have ligament and tendon injuries, etc. Dachshunds and corgis also being kind of long-bodied You'll also see something similar in the spine because it's sort of, I mean, it has nothing to do with their short legs. It's just their long bodies relative to like kind of how they maybe should be built if you're thinking about a normal conformation of a dog. But it's sort of like, you know, if you were going to try to span a 3-foot gap, you probably wouldn't think too much about putting a few 2x4s across it and walking on it. But like, what if you took a 2x4 and tried to get across a 30-foot gap? It's going to bow in the middle, right? And the same effect happens to the spine. And so it's experiencing this weird physical stress that it is not ready to deal with. And so you'll have back problems in those dogs very classically, and slip discs is a really common issue in those dogs. Mm-hmm. So once again, wolves not dealing with this so much because they have never experienced that kind of physical selection pressure that we have put onto these purebred dogs. Hey, and this is actually an old study I dug up from the 90s. They were really interested in this, and then they kind of settled the issue, closed the book, and nobody ever worried about it again. But they were interested in knowing about the secretions and the molecular structure that kind of makes up the paw pad. And the very short conclusion, punchline of that research project was that there's a difference between the volume and type of secretions that are coming out of these paw pads, the robustness of the paw pad, like physically, but also in an antimicrobial sense, like as a barrier against bacteria. And it all really, you look at the wolf, they have massive territories, they travel long distances. It makes sense that they would then find that these dogs have more and more intense secretions coming from their paw pads. Their paw pads appear to also be just more physically robust because they travel longer distances, and scent marking is really important for territory. Whereas for our domestic dogs who have slightly different molecules in their secretions, lower intensity of secretions, and slightly less robust paw pads, you know, they're protecting their like half-acre yard. So they've got less work to do. And it seems like that lift on the pressure led to changes in how those paw pads are created. Behavior. This is a really complex topic, and I'm going to start off by saying that it's a product of both genetics and environment. It's very, very complicated. There's a lot of debate in it, and it's very hard to test. That said, there are some things that we know. But first one has to do with eye contact. Eye contact is a really important mechanism of communication among all canid species, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure you guys all know, like you have a dog who's like a little sketchy, don't like stare at it like this because it's not going to take that well. I mean, that kind of goes into this concept of eye contact. And they've tested, researchers are so interested in interspecies communication, right? Because dogs and humans communicating with each other, I mean, that model, where else does that exist on Earth? So we're really interested in that. Also, fun fact, dogs were actually the first animal that humans ever domesticated, right? So this is just a long history. There's a lot of interest there. So when dogs and humans stare at each other, have eye contact in a friendly situation, like a dog and its owner, there's actually an increase in oxytocin in both brains, the love hormone. And we see that domestic dogs compared to wolves, even captive raised wolves, hand raised wolves, wolves raised by humans. Domestic dogs will more readily try to catch humans' gaze, like make eye contact with you. In problem-solving situations, they'll actually gaze to the human for help. They'll hold the gaze for longer. Whereas wolves, I mean, I don't know if they've ever tested on wild wolves, but certainly hand-reared captive wolves will largely ignore humans from an eye contact perspective. When they do hold a gaze, they don't do it for very long. And they tend to try to tackle problem solving by themselves, as opposed to seeking human help. So we know that. We know that there are differences in the instinct or the cognition that underlies this seeking out of interspecies cooperation. From a problem solving perspective, I just mentioned that wolves like kind of just try to tackle it on their own. But what's really interesting is that for a long time, there was this theory that domesticating dogs and selecting for tameness would naturally mean that these dogs were less aggressive, more cooperative, even amongst themselves, that you're selecting for these very like Mr. Rogers neighborhood kind of traits. But in fact, we find the opposite to be true. So what they're seeing is that comparing domestic dogs to contemporary wolves, that dogs, I want to make sure I get this right because it's a tongue twister. Dogs tend to cooperate with each other less than wolves cooperate with each other. Dogs tend to be generally more aggressive with each other than wolves tend to be. That said, when wolves are aggressive, it's like intensity level 10, right? But in terms of frequency or just the tendency of a very binary yes or no, dogs tend to be more aggressive with each other than wolves do. And the thinking for that is that, again, as you move from pack hunter, where your livelihood depends on this, and also dogs tend to be more hierarchical than wolves do. Even though there's a pack structure to wolves, dogs tend to like care a lot more about it, apparently. Now the thought is that that has to do with pack life and needing cooperative hunting and needing to work together. Whereas dogs, again, shifting to that scavenger, shifting to the human as being the ultra alpha in the social circle, basically change the way that dogs interact or see each other. And again, it's not to say that it's like they hate each other. They don't. Dogs are friends all the time. But as far as comparing the two, there is a difference now in the how they socially operate, if you will. Does that all make sense? It's a very complex topic I'm trying to distill into 2 sentences. I'm not sure if I'm doing a good job. And then we also have modern day breed differences that are huge. You all know this. Border collies, selected specifically for a very particular job. German shepherds, different job. Jack Russell Terriers go into that tunnel and get that rodent. Different jobs have emphasized certain social and cognitive skills in our dogs as well. So like border collies or these shepherd dogs are really keyed into this like visual communication between, you know, where are you looking? Okay, I'm going to look there. They're really, really good at that. Whereas other breeds of dogs are not as good at that. And that's been very, very well established in research that these breed differences are very, very strong. Okay. I'm going to leave it there. So behavior, again, big factor of genetics, environment, how you're raised, your husbandry, et cetera. But there are definitely some differences that have trickled through to be kind of a universal truth. And then this picture was, they're all gazing very intently at the person who's taking the picture at this holiday party, except for my little goober over here. Because I'm standing right here. Oh. And I think that's all I have. So one final comparison. Oh. And I think we have some time for questions if anybody wants questions. That's enough, though, right? I mean, I think that's questions.
If somebody raised their hand first, you can go ahead.
We'll start here.
Okay. You mentioned that the maternal instinct sort of shuts off at an earlier age with dogs, and your explanation makes perfect sense. The maturity rate, though, from puppyhood to doghood and, you know, wolf pup to adult wolf, how similar is that trajectory?
From a physical sense, it's pretty close. I mean, we do have a lot of differences, even like taking a step back between in domestic dogs, large breed dogs and small breed dogs mature at different rates skeletally. Okay. But it's a difference of maybe at most 6 months to 8 months, maybe for the giants a year. Wolves achieve a physical maturity before they become totally independent of their mother. So there is that difference. Or of their parent, I should say. But of course, there's degrees, right? I mean, they're not the same level of dependent at 2 months old as opposed to 2 years old. Yeah, but it's a really good question.
More than more than very often, I have asked myself the question, who domesticated whom? And-
That's a
and-
great question.
And it's because it had to be a two-way street. There was advantages that each saw in the other,
Yeah.
but we are in control more, so we see the changes in the canine. But were there changes in us as a species group?
That's a great question.
Because we,
That's a great question. I have no idea. I was focused on the canine side of things. That's a really good question though. And I mean, who knows? I'm sure, well, I have some archaeology history for you that might be a little bit disheartening to hear. But the process of domestication was not always so rosy, actually. So they have, remains, I think, from the Czech Republic that go back to 27 or 28,000 years. And they were finding evidence that these dogs that were being kept by humans, and essentially, that very early domestication, were not being kept as helpers or companions. I mean, they were confined, they were fed second-rate food. They often had like skull or dental injuries indicating like being beaten or hit and stuff like that. But they were also finding remains that indicated maybe like some sacrificial role that they were using them for. And so it was not very nice. And then as hunting moved from like open plains style hunting into more the forests, dogs actually became useful. And that's exactly when you see this huge uptick in ceremonial burials involving dogs, where they're honoring their dogs, they're burying them with special objects, they're putting them in special positions, they're burying them with other humans, things like that. And so we see this change in the significance of them. And then agriculture kind of led to like a decrease in their significance in that way again. So you see that drop off again, although they were significant because they were a food source. So that changed a little bit. And then we also then started to diversify the roles of dogs as humans started to diversify what they were doing. And we saw this uptick again in their significance. So it was a little bit of a roller coaster ride actually, and very much not linear and very much not one input. It's not like there were a lot of failed experiments along the way, if you want to think of it that way, right? So to what degree there are changes maybe that mirror this in humans, I don't know, but that would be very interesting to ask an anthropologist about.
Mhm. I have a question about the Russian study that you're talking about with the foxes. Over how many generations are you seeing that those ears go down? Must be very quick.
Pretty quick. I mean, it's been ongoing for 60 years and it's still happening.
Years is all.
But the changes were much more immediate than that. I think within a few generations, a handful maybe, they were seeing these changes. Yeah.
And then they could do it in reverse.
Mhm,
If they rebred for the aggressive traits, within a few generations, it would go the absolute reverse. You get the pointy ears,
Mhm.
the
The
nasal.
elongated
yeah,
muzzle.
mhm.
Yep. Yeah. Very nice proof of concept there. Okay, does anybody want to see skulls?
I do, but I have one more question, then I have to leave to get children. They would have been a great example of, an excellent distraction. We have a dog in the car we thought about bringing in for like an exhibit A.
I thought about that.
But the genetic tests, I've never done one for my two dogs. I've been tempted, curious, but I don't know how much proof in science there is to those, particularly because so many of those are rooted in find out your dog's inner wolf, blah, 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 blah. And I'm just a skeptic in that regard.
Yeah, so it's a mixed bag. So there are certainly changes that these tests can detect between breed groupings very reliably. So like the herding dogs versus the guard dogs versus the scent dogs, not surprisingly, because of all this intensive breeding that happened all along the way. So they can find those markers really easily. But, you know, when you get more minute and you get dogs who are in the same bucket and maybe their breed split much more recently or was created more recently, it gets a little bit more nuanced. There's a lot of mush in there. So they might, you usually get an answer that's like half right, half guesswork. So you get an answer where they're like, okay, so here's some clear bullet points, but then we have all this other stuff that we don't know how to interpret. So we're just going to make a best guess and call it a corgi or whatever. And so you'll get kind of a mixed bag on that.
Do you have any that you've seen that you believe have any for additional merit to other ones?
I don't know that I have an opinion between brands, no.
Thank you very, very, very much. I would love to look at skulls, but I have to go look at children. Thank you.
Are there any modern dogs in any parts of the world that actually like trace themselves through to other wild canids, like since they broke off from wolves? So like, is there anything that got domesticated out of, say, a jackal?
Not to my knowledge,
Okay.
but there are ancient breeds of domestic dogs. The Senjis are like one example. And those breeds are considered ancient because they experience less selection pressure. Also, if you can't hear me in the back, let me know. I'm talking quieter now. They experience less selection pressure and therefore maintained more diversity within their pool, which makes them closer to the wolf ancestor. And that's why they're called ancient breeds. There's 230 breeds of dogs, 140 like feral-ish dogs, and then one dingo, all in that domestic dog umbrella. Lots of interbreeding there. You can still interbreed. I mean, there's wolf dog breeds now that are very much more recent because you can make fertile offspring between wolves and dogs. But that's so recent that they do use them in comparisons for behavior tests and cognition because they kind of are this in between. And actually, interestingly, result-wise, they do land in between whatever the wolves and the dogs are doing in the studies usually. That's kind of cool. But I don't know of any domesticated jackals or anything like that. It'd be cool. It's kind of like you know, you think about raccoons or skunks that people keep as pets. I wouldn't call them domesticated though. So people might occasionally keep a jackal, but or a fox even. We know people keep pet foxes, but they're not domesticated in the same way that the Russians are.
I was interested by the cladogram. If I followed it correctly, you said the coyote is Canis latrans, if you prefer, completely separate, a different branch from wolves, so they did not descend from wolves either.
Not our modern day wolves, no.
Right. So, a couple questions within that. How similar are their genetics, and do they ever interbreed? And is that why there is so much animosity between the wolves and the coyotes? They don't seem to get along in the wild.
They don't, because they're usually competing for the same position in the food chain and the ecosystem.
Okay.
So they don't like each other very much. Wolves and coyotes do interbreed. And on the East Coast, you'll actually see those. I think they're called coy wolves or something. They'll usually have one big allele and one little allele because it's the little mix they're doing. But that's really interesting, especially in like the New England, Northeast kind of Canada area over there, because wolves have been eliminated from that ecosystem. We're seeing that coyotes that did interbreed with wolves when there was the opportunity to, they have the larger body size, and we're actually seeing that they are thriving in those environments because they're actually stepping into that niche that wolves were occupying. Whereas when they coexist, wolves and coyotes in the same place, coyotes are usually dealing with smaller game and wolves are taking the big stuff. So, but yeah, no, they can. I mean, at least coyotes and wolves can. I don't know if I've ever heard of fox and a wolf or something, but it's certainly possible. So again, you know, these splits, they look huge here, but obviously there's a lot of retained similarity to make that possible.
Is their DNA also at like 99.9% similarity? Since they can interbreed?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's a good question. I don't know. Interbreed and make fertile offspring, which is kind of the clincher. Yep.
The common ancestor you've spoken about, is that, how has that been identified as a part of the picture?
So basically there've been a couple different efforts. I mean, one effort was a massive genetic survey of the living and existing wolves and dogs that are around. But a huge part of, and I mentioned that that's a confusing picture because dogs move around a lot. And so you can't geographically pinpoint like a genetic locus in one place or another, because again, it's been all like moved around the board. What they've really done though is there was a group of researchers that have gone around and just sampled specimens everywhere they can find them, every museum, every collection, archaeologic sites, everything. And they basically use this to piecemeal together this genetic mapping, where they can actually identify and trace back genetic changes through a variety of methods. The exact specific markers that they were using, I can't rattle off the top of my head, but basically they were just massively sampling everything they could get their hands on and then using it to reconstruct the pathway back. Does that make sense? That's the best answer I can give you without getting into specifics, which I don't have in my head.
Did you happen to see that piece on TV within the last couple of weeks on the behavior comparison between wolves and dogs, where they put a person in a room all by him or herself, and then they brought in a dog, for instance, that did not know the person. They let the dog in a door. In this room was just the one person in the chair. Person was just sitting there inactive. And the dogs, they did this with numerous dogs. The dogs would all come in and sit down within a very small radius of where the person was. And then they did the same thing with wolves. And when the wolves came in, these were domesticated type wolves. And when the wolves came in, they pretty much ignored the person. They just went and laid down someplace else and didn't really pay much attention at all to the person.
That's a really great example of one of the behavior studies that they do with the wolves versus dogs. And I mean, there are a number of, it's such an interesting field that so many researchers are a part of, that there are all kinds of really interesting experiments being done. And they'll also do it dog versus cat. You know, I mean, that's a little off topic, but one of my favorites that I remember is they'd have the owner of the animal and then an actor. And the actor would either be really nice or really mean to the owner. And then they'd leave the room and come back, and that actor would then offer the pet a treat. And dogs would generally not be willing to take a treat from somebody who was mean to their owner. Cats did not care. They took the treat no matter what. So I like that one. And to the point of the cuteness question as well, there was another study a few years ago where they took just pictures of puppies and pictures of human babies, normalized for like age and developmental state across all stages of puppyhood and infanthood. And they had people just rate the cuteness basically. Puppies won.
So with everything that you've studied already, what's your next step? Like, what do you find the most interesting that you want to keep pursuing or testing?
Well, I'm still always really interested in conservation. And there's a group of us who are, you know, the nearest rehab is in Cody for wildlife. So we're hoping to get something going here sometime in the near future. But otherwise, what I do a lot of right now is consulting in veterinary education and veterinary counseling. And the counseling is for veterinary professionals as well as pet owners. So the idea is spectrum of care, access to care, compassion fatigue, grief counseling. So it's a little bit psychology, a lot still veterinary medicine, and just trying to reach some broader audiences with lifting people up. Because in the field right now, there's a lot of both from professionals and I think from clients, I think there's a lot of struggling going on in veterinary medicine. Yeah. So that's where I am looking at the moment. But I still do I still do work because I love to touch the animals. So I still do mobile vet services for dogs and cats.
I know you were talking about the diet of the wolf versus
Yeah.
our modern dogs. Is there like something, a diet that you recommend I mean, because we started giving our dogs more, I guess, human food, but stuff that we consider healthy.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if there was something that is better for the dogs.
Honestly, I think the biggest thing that there's actually a few things I tell people. The biggest one is if your dog's doing great on it and they're happy and their poops are good. If you're trying to select a new food for whatever reason, just make sure it's formulated by a veterinary nutritionist or someone with a PhD in nutrition. Because where we've run into problems, especially now with a lot of boutique brands popping up, is that some of those are not formulated by a professional who understands nutrient balance and availability. Because just because it's in the kibble or in the food doesn't mean your dog can digest it or that they won't just poop it out. Or that whatever's in there isn't going to interfere with the availability of something else that they really need. Okay. And so that's part of, I mean, you probably have all heard about the FDA investigation into the diets, and maybe it was grain, but that it was causing a heart condition in dogs, dilated cardiomyopathy. It's very sneaky. You can't hear a murmur. You never know your dog has it until they drop dead, pretty much, or go into heart failure. And they're still investigating it. I don't know if that investigation is ever going to close, but from talking with a number of nutritionists in the course of my work in dog food, both PhDs and veterinarians, the bottom line is that grain-free diets, for example, and even novel protein like kangaroo diets or things like that, those have been made for a very long time with no problems. But the problem comes up when you try to make those diets without knowing how to balance them properly on a nutrient level. Because what you're doing is you're replacing like an animal protein with a plant protein or whatever it is that you're doing. But fundamentally, that represents a different nutrient profile. And not knowing how to balance them is how we get into trouble with our dogs. So really, it's, does your dog do well on it? Is it formulated by a veterinarian? And ideally also, whoever's making it, hopefully they don't have a lot of recalls in their record from a quality standpoint. But other than that, like, fresh foods that are cooked, if you want to do that, great, do it. Raw foods, I have a little bit of an issue with just for the same reason that I would not recommend that you lick a raw chicken breast. Okay, because it's the same idea. Even dogs who don't get sick from salmonella or E. coli can shed it a lot, and they can make you sick, or they can make a loved one sick, or babies, or anybody who's immunocompromised. The nutrient availability and content of a food, if you literally take that raw food and stick it in the boiling pot of water, cook it, and then feed it to your dog, will be exactly the same. So just feed them cooked food. That's my only thing that I ask people to do. But otherwise, if it works for your dog and you're feeling good about it, and they're happy, and their poops are good, and their coat looks nice, then you're on track. Then you're doing great. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Proverbs worth, I buy my dogs what's on sale at Petco. So everyone can find what works for them. Okay. Anybody else? All right, I think we're over time, but I'm going to leave these skulls out for a few minutes if anybody wants to.
Speed around and ask questions, check on skills. Thank you.